Welcome to Nature's Guardians. I'm Micah Siegel. Each week, I talk with people working to save and help animals around the world. They are nature's guardians, and you can become one too. Today, I'm talking with Davyth Stewart, formerly with the Interpol Environmental Security Program, and now he's an independent expert on environmental crime. Welcome to the show, Davyth.
Thank you very much, Micah. Nice to be here.
Wait, what should be the first question? Okay, so what's your hot issue right now?
Thank you, Micah. I've been working in wildlife trafficking, timber trafficking, and environmental crime for quite some time. And one of the key issue that I think we're seeing now amongst the law enforcement community is a recognition that the amount of money to be made from environmental crime is significant. It's comparable with the money made from drug trafficking and firearms trafficking. And so there's been a shift lately in the law enforcement community to understand the need to focus on following that money and confiscating that money and taking it out of the hands of criminals, because that's the money used that keeps the criminal enterprise going. It keeps the wildlife smuggling going. And if we can take that money out of the hands of criminals, we can dismantle these criminal networks, make them inoperable, and ultimately target the people that are looking to profit from wildlife crime. So what I would say is the really hot issue at the moment is getting banks to understand that they have a role in laundering the proceeds from these environmental criminals, and that the financial investigators in the police need to work with wildlife officers, with environmental officers, to help them trace the proceeds of crime. And that's a shift that we're seeing in the law enforcement community. There's a recognition that they need to follow the money. But of course, that's a different way of looking at environmental crime. And people need training. Wildlife officers need to understand how to follow the money. Banks need to understand how to identify suspicious activity that's related to wildlife trafficking, and these sorts of things. So that's really within the law enforcement community. That's where the law enforcement focus is at the moment, on how do we deal with wildlife trafficking.
So where are you in this situation? What are you doing?
Well, I work as an advisor, independent advisor to some various organizations, some non-governmental organizations, some intergovernmental, and also to banks and financial institutions, really trying to help them understand how does wildlife trafficking work, where is the money associated with the wildlife trafficking, and so that they can start to improve the way they look at financial flows. That, there's a lot of experience in looking at money linked to drug trafficking, but not so much experience looking at wildlife trafficking. So I'm trying to help, working with colleagues, working with others, working with banks in particular, to understand how they can play a role in identifying the money.
Okay, so show us your presentation.
Okay.
Okay, fine. Your presentation ready for us.
Yes, let me just share the screen.
Okay.
Okay, can you see that screen now?
Yeah, I can.
Right. Yeah, I just thought I'd give a quick overview of wildlife trafficking, how it works, the illegal capture and the killing of wildlife, principally for sale on international markets. My background, as you mentioned, for almost a decade, I worked as a coordinator with Interpol's environmental crime unit, and I've been working in law enforcement for almost 20 years. Most of that time has been focused on the illegal killing and the smuggling of wildlife and timber. So Interpol, it's an international criminal police organization. It has offices called the National Central Bureau across basically all the countries of the world. It helps principally to link them together so that police in different countries can cooperate. As you know, criminals do not respect international borders. So really, we're trying to get police from different countries to work together to address crime that takes place across different borders. And this is obviously particularly important in the illegal trade of wildlife. Animals are caught and then killed in one country and then smuggled to markets that are in other countries. The three biggest markets where most of the illegal wildlife is ending up is the USA, Europe, and China. So different animals, depending on the species, are taken from different parts of the world, and they tend to end up in one of those three markets. So, Micah, you probably know what animal this is?
Yeah, pangolin.
Yes, this scaly anteater, it's the pangolin. So why do you think that I've put a picture of a pangolin here while I'm talking about illegal wildlife trafficking?
Because there's demand in traditional Chinese medicine for their scales, but it doesn't really work.
Yeah, there's a massive demand for pangolins. In fact, based on police seizure data, pangolins are the most illegally trafficked animal in the world. So, I mean, pangolins are found in sub-Saharan Africa and in Asia. So this map here shows where the different species of pangolins are found. Now, pangolins are protected under international law. So any international trade in pangolins is illegal. But despite this ban, of course, there's a high demand for pangolins in southern China and in Vietnam in particular. And as you can see from this map, there are native species of pangolins that are found in Vietnam and southern China, but these species are almost wiped out. And so now many of the species that are found in other countries are also being threatened by extinction, largely as a result of hunters who are capturing the pangolins and then smuggling them off to China and to Vietnam. There's a particular demand for their scales for traditional Chinese and Vietnamese medicines. So this is a police seizure of pangolin scales that was made in Singapore in 2019. There were 14,000 kilograms of pangolin scales that were being shipped from Nigeria, where they'd been collected from Central Africa, on their way to Vietnam. When the ship was stopped in Singapore, on its way to Vietnam, the authorities seized the shipping container. So this is 14,000 kilograms. That's equivalent to over 30,000 pounds in your measurements. The shipment of pangolin scales here is valued at almost $40 million on the black market. Now, the scales... Sorry. Go.
How many penguins are that? Is that... I'm not speaking English correctly.
How many pangolins... I don't know how many kilograms of scales you can get off each pangolin. I would estimate less than a kilogram or around a kilogram. So you're talking, in the order of 14,000 pangolins, maybe more, that were killed to supply these scales here. Now, as you mentioned, there's a demand for the scales. They're ground up into a powder and then used to make traditional medicines. Now, there is, as you said, there's no reliable scientific evidence that pangolin scales have any medicinal value. But of course, they've been used in traditional Chinese medicines for thousands of years. And because of this long history, there's still many doctors in China and Vietnam who continue to prescribe medicines made with pangolin scales. And in fact, pangolin scales are still included in the official Chinese medical books that are approved by the Chinese Ministry of Health. So there's going to remain this ongoing demand, despite the lack of modern scientific evidence showing any real value. And there's also demand for pangolin meat, which is eaten in both Africa, where they're often poached, and also in Asia. And in Asia, the meat is eaten as a luxury dish. It's a delicacy that's served often in high-end restaurants. So as we were mentioning, the amount of money involved in illegal wildlife trade, it's estimated to be worth about up to 23 billion every year in illegal wildlife trade. So with this amount of money involved, then of course it's not surprising to see organized criminal groups.
We have to, Davyth, there was a sound issue. So when you say it again, it's estimated how many billion?
Okay. Um, so the illegal wildlife trade is estimated globally to be worth as much as $23 billion per year. So with this amount of money, then obviously it's not surprising to see organised criminal groups becoming involved in wildlife trafficking. So we're often, in fact, seeing criminal groups that have been involved in other criminal activities, such as drug trafficking or firearm smuggling, also moving into environmental crime. In fact, in environmental crime, they can make almost as much money, but the risks are lower to them. The risks are lower because wildlife officers often have less resources and less tools available to them than the drugs or the firearms crime units have. So it's a lower risk, but equally as profitable crime to move from drug trafficking firearms into wildlife trafficking. In fact, sometimes the drug traffickers use live animals to help hide drug shipments. So this is an example of some drug smugglers who hid 35 kilograms of cocaine inside the bodies of live snakes that were being transported from Colombia to the US. Each of these snakes were 4 to 5 feet long. So clearly not really something that a customs official is going to want to inspect closely. It's not something that they're going to want to pick up and look at the snakes too closely, which makes them something that drug dealers will think that they can put the drugs inside an animal like this, and most people will leave it alone, and the drugs can then move across the border.
How do they
There's also many examples of
how do they put the drugs inside? Do they just feed the drugs to it?
So in this particular case of the cocaine that was being shipped from Colombia, they sedated the drug smugglers, sedated the animals, and then stuffed pellets of cocaine inside their rectum, and then sewed the rectums up.
Okay. That's very weird.
So many of these many of the animals actually died in this particular case. So there are also many examples of drug cartels who work with the timber industry to smuggle drugs hidden inside timber shipments. And of course, another issue that comes when organised crime become more involved in environmental crime is that they bring with them their violent tactics. So criminal groups are often engaged in intimidation of law enforcement officials and environmental activists. And there's a few studies that have counted up the numbers of people killed, and on average, every 2 days, someone's killed by a criminal gang because they're trying to defend the natural environment from logging operations, from poachers, from criminals who are trying to illegally extract natural resources from the country. So the way the criminals smuggle the wildlife is very similar actually to the way they move drugs across borders. So they find some poor, desperate person who's in a difficult situation, and they pay them money to hide the wildlife within their luggage or hidden under their clothes, and then they can board an airplane. So it's hiding the drugs, or hiding the wildlife on their person under their clothes is particularly common with bird eggs and reptile eggs, because the body temperature can then help keep the eggs warm while they're in transit. We see cases of snakes that are put inside the pockets of people's jackets, and they take them onto aeroplanes, or even things, eggs and very small baby animals put inside people's underpants, and they use that to then get through the security checks at the airport and get onto the aeroplane. And we also see animals smuggled inside luggage, which they then take onto aeroplanes. So there's some various photos here I've included. This is turtles that have been strapped up with masking tape to keep them inside their shells, so then they can be hidden inside luggage. And there are birds, of course, that are also smuggled inside luggage through airport luggage. Here's some parrots that were hidden inside a Pringles chip packet with holes for them to breathe. So as you can imagine, smuggling like this puts a lot of stress on the animals. And in fact, for some animals, 80 to 90% of them die before they ever reach their destination. So for example, for every chimpanzee that you see that's kept as a pet or in a zoo, another 10 have died during the capture and the transport. And the African grey parrot, which is also a very popular pet, 2/3 of them died during their capture. So of course, this means that criminals need to capture large numbers of animals to ensure that enough will survive and make it through to the end destination to meet the consumer demand. So they have to catch 5, 6 to 10 times as many animals as actually they need, because most of them will die and not make it. So all of these are examples really of animals that are being illegally captured from the wild and then trafficked to places like America and like Europe to supply the exotic pet trade. So I know that you have a pet parrot.
Yeah.
So of course, if you want to keep exotic pets, then you really need to be very careful to make sure that you're not contributing to any illegal wildlife smuggling. And so the best way to do this is to make sure you've done your research, you know the origin of your animal. For example, make sure that you've checked that it's been born through an official breeding program, that it's been born in captivity, and if you're acquiring your exotic pets from reputable breeders, then you can avoid animals that might have been captured from the wild and smuggled and sold as if they were, sold through the exotic pet market. So that's really a summary of some of the sort of the key wildlife trafficking issues that I thought I'd run through with you.
That was amazingly informative, and I didn't know they put animals in Pringles cups. They really put them in all sorts of containers to get by.
Yeah, anything that they can really hide it into their luggage and then take it through an airport.
Do you have any stories of finding animals being trafficked on airplanes, like the dude sitting next to you secretly had a penguin in his pocket or something?
I've never personally been on aeroplanes where that has happened, and maybe I have and not known it. There are certainly cases of people who are taking animals through into their luggage and through onto aeroplanes, and then it's only because usually the animal is sedated in some way so that it sleeps, or hopefully sleeps for the flight. Occasionally they make a noise, and then people hear the noise and alert the air hostess and so on, and it then becomes an issue. But a lot of it, many of them die in transit anyway, so you don't hear those ones. But there's quite a significant trafficking. Quite a lot of animals are moved on aeroplanes this way, and obviously if you're trying to move a live animal, the fastest way you can move it, the better. So aeroplanes are obviously the most popular way to do that, and particularly direct routes. So if you're looking at particular animals that are highly sought in particular destinations, then you're looking for the most direct airline routes. So Madagascar, for example, has the most unique biodiversity in the world, amazing species of chameleons and other animals, reptiles, that are highly sought after in the exotic pet trade in Europe and in North America. And so direct flights between Madagascar and Europe, or Madagascar and North America, if there are any, are going to be the most vulnerable to that sort of trafficking. I've worked a lot with Madagascar in the past on rosewood trafficking. So the most valuable wildlife commodity being trafficked is rosewood. And in particular, Malagasy rosewood is really highly valued, and there's been a lot of incidences of rosewood coming out of Madagascar to supply high-end furniture demands, particularly in China and Vietnam and countries like that, where it's processed and made into high-value furniture. And a lot of places like Madagascar have very limited sort of law enforcement controls around their border. They've got one international airport in Antananarivo, but they've got a lot of coastline that is not protected by not easily patrolled by enforcement agencies. So ships sort of can come in, dock off the a few hundred meters off the shore, and smaller boats just come out to them and bring timber shipments, and perhaps bring wildlife shipments out to the boats, and then they can sail off to another port where they can, if it's wildlife, get it onto an aeroplane, or timber can be shipped directly to markets in Asia.
Very interesting. They also put cocaine and stuff in wood, so that even more deforestation inside the drug business. So, yeah.
Yes, yeah. And I mean, there's a lot of, there's a couple of particular regions in the world where you have a high production of drugs, the Golden Triangle in Southeast Asia, and also in the Amazon basin, where you also have a lot of timber and a lot of logging.
Yeah.
And so those places in particular are where drug runners and timber smugglers work together. There's cases that I've looked at when I was at Interpol, where we were looking into a timber smuggler, so a timber company that was cutting timber illegally in the Amazon, and then smuggling that timber across the borders into timber markets. And they had done that through paying bribes to local law enforcement officials, to forest officers and to customs and border control people. They were paying them a simple bribe to move a truck of timber across the border. And the amount of money you need to pay to turn a blind eye to a timber shipment is not so much in some of these places. But through this sort of corrupt network, they'd established an extensive sort of network for smuggling timber. The relevant officials had been paid off, so no shipments were being inspected. And so they had set up a really nice illegal trade flow. And so then the logging company started working with local drug dealers. And now they started hiding drugs inside their timber shipments. And because the customs officials thought it was just a timber shipment, and they had already received a relatively small bribe to allow the timber shipment to go through, they just continued to let them go through. And so, we were now having a much more serious criminal activity happening with the drugs, but the law enforcement response, hadn't changed, and the corruption established by the timber company had allowed then much more serious criminal activity to take place through the same trade routes.
Can you pick a specific species and take us through the whole supply chain from capture to auction?
Okay, well, because I'm speaking to you from France, I'll talk about a species that's vulnerable to poaching here in France, and so that's the European eel that I mentioned earlier. So European eels, live in the river systems of predominantly of southwestern Europe, of Spain, of France, even the UK, but they're highly valued for the food market in China and in Asia. But the international trade out of Europe to Asia is protected. There's an international ban, and all of that trade is illegal. So there's a lot of poaching of European eels, and they target them when they're very young, and they can sort of go through during the fishing season. The poachers will go through particular river systems and collect as much eels as they can. And then those eels are collected by they sort of move their way to an intermediary stop where a broker collects eels from different poachers from different rivers, and they brings them to their warehouse and they put them inside water tanks, aerated water tanks, where they can collect them up into large amounts, and then they arrange for them to be shipped to Asia. At this point, they're usually the local sort of gangs involved in the poaching of the eels hand over to Chinese gangs, who then sort of coordinate the shipment of the eels to China. They do that by putting the eels inside plastic bags and putting them inside luggage and shipping them on aeroplanes. And they need to move relatively quickly because the eels don't survive in these tanks for very long. They need to get them moved as quickly as possible. So mostly they're on direct flights from Europe to Asia, and they put the eels inside plastic bags, put them inside luggage, and then a group of sort of mules, we call the people who sort of carry the illicit goods across the borders are called mules. They come pick up the eels and jump on direct aeroplane and take them to Asia, and then from there they've grown. They go into sort of into fish farms in Asia, and then they get grown to large eels. So they can be captured here in Europe. They're worth about 400 euros per kilogram of eels. To the poacher on the ground who collects 1 kilo gets about 400 euros. It then sort of doubles and triples in value at each stage as it moves along that supply chain in value, and then the final product that is grown into a full-size adult for the market in Asia can be worth $9,000 for the same kilo. So you're sort of talking, 20 times the value as it moves along the market. The eels then in China are sold on to, the European eel is highly valued. It's more of a delicacy. It's worth a lot more. And then it's sold, through restaurants, Chinese restaurants and so on in Asia. A lot of those eels end up being trafficked back to Europe, often labeled as either a Japanese eel or North American eel. But they get trafficked back into Europe and sold again through Chinese restaurants and things within Europe. And that's a way of helping bring the revenue back as well, because restaurants are a very good place to launder illegal proceeds because a lot of payments are made in cash. And so a lot of the finances from this smuggling network can be brought back into Europe, laundered through restaurants in Europe, and then used again to pay for next year's fishing season when people are out there illegally collecting more European eels.
Never thought about eel trafficking. Very interesting.
Yeah, it's. I mean, in Europe, at this end of the market, it's each year they conduct operations to try and stop and seize it, stop the practice. Each year they're sort of shutting down $10 million worth of trade, but it's worth 50 times that. I mean, the trade is worth international trade in the Chinese end and the European end is hundreds of millions.
Is there anything that CITES does about international trade of animal parts that you disagree with?
I think, as you know, CITES is my primary concern with CITES is that you see a lot of people coming together to discuss policies and legislation and laws, but actually it's not backed up by the enforcement on the ground. So what's the point of trying to regulate quotas for certain species if the existing quotas are not being enforced? So really the problem is that the CITES decisions being made at an international level are not really well aligned with what's actually happening on the ground. Law enforcement don't have the resources they need to properly uphold the laws that are on the books. And so that sort of undermines CITES. It undermines people's respect for CITES. There isn't that governance on the ground that you need to make CITES work. It's complicated also by corruption that happens, because a lot of the animals that we're trying to protect are in countries that have a low GDP, that are poor, and the wildlife enforcement officers are often the worst paid amongst the law enforcement community. So, they don't have a lot of money. They have incentives to take bribes.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about money. Why are the anti-poachers protecting an elephant? For the same reason that the trophy hunters, that the poachers want to get the elephant. Money, right?
Yeah.
Just like drugs, just like a lot of different crimes. It's very similar.
Yeah, I think there's, money's certainly something, a big part of it. And I think, the conservation movement is always under pressure to find ways that allowing the animal to stay alive will make money. Because, if they can't convince the government, or they can't convince people that not poaching the animal or keeping, allowing the animal to continue to live in the wild, they have to find a way to convince you that that's going to make money. And certainly there are ways. So, tourism, ecotourism, to go and see animals in the wild is a very valuable way that animals can bring money in for a country. But that really applies mostly to things like elephants and rhinos and lions and these sorts of animals that people will pay and go and see, go on safari to see. There are a lot of animals that are ugly, not very attractive, or nocturnal, and are not. It's hard to sell those as a tourist attraction. So there is elements that it becomes a different. They say, well, how can we make money from these animals without killing them? You have that. You do have that conflict, but then you do also have a moral argument about the right to leave animals in peace and to allow them to prosper and to recognize their rights to exist. That is a purely moral argument and not one based on money.
If you had one wish to reduce trafficking, what would it be?
Wildlife enforcement officers are often sort of the poor cousins of the law enforcement community. They're often within the sort of the law enforcement various crime units. They often have the least resources, the lowest pay for the staff. Often enforcement officers, they struggle to get petrol for their car, so they can't go on patrol. They can't really do their job properly because they just don't have the financial resources they need to do their job. So I would certainly like to see more investment in law enforcement. As I mentioned, the value of wildlife trafficking and environmental crime is very similar to the value of drug trafficking and firearms and other sort of serious crimes. But if you look at the amount of money that's invested in police to deal with drug trafficking and firearms trafficking, it's hundreds of times more than the amount of money given to wildlife to wildlife enforcement.
What do you plan to be doing for animal trafficking in the next 4 or 5 years?
I think my focus going forward is going to be trying to work with banks and financial institutions to improve the way that they detect illicit money that's in their system that's linked to wildlife trafficking. I think that finding ways to identify that money and help law enforcement seize and confiscate the proceeds of crime, I think is going to be a really important step going forward.
Thank you so much for talking with me today, Davyth, and thank you for watching. You can help animals by hitting the like button and subscribing to this channel. I'll see you next time on Nature's Guardians.